All right, here we go. So we're here today with Professor Kehinde Andrews. Totally thrilled. So Kehinde, welcome to the Brains and Banter podcast. This is our first recording, and we're totally thrilled to have you. Just absolutely love your book too. It's so powerful and important right now, and I think it's just so honest about the change that is really needed, right? It's absolutely urgent. We need to totally transform the capitalist system, dismantle it, right? So we can start new. So I was in your book, you do talk about, I wanted to use the quotation that I think was really great, that nothing short of a revolution that overturns the very foundations of empire can ever undo the problem of racism, which itself is at the heart of the global political economic system. So one more quotation is perfect. You say, to live in a better world, we have to participate in the overthrow of this one. So I'm just wondering if you can say more about revolution and what that will involve and who that will involve and all of that.
You started with an easy question.
Easy, very easy.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing I'd say straight away is that a revolution isn't what people generally think. So generally people would think it's violence and it's picking up weapons, and that's not what revolutionary processes are about. A revolution is about saying, one, you have to understand the scale of the problem and that it is literally patterned into everything that we do, with the economy, the way things work, the way the politics work. In fact, there was a right-wing critique. The right-wing critique of the book basically is, he's saying racism is in everything, which is true. Racism is in everything. Like, it is actually the glue that holds everything together. And so once you understand that, that means that you can't reform it. It just can't be reformed. And so revolution is simply a process of building something different. The question is, what is that alternative? There are different ways to do it. This book is a prequel to Back to Black, Retelling Black Radicalism for the 21st century, where I argue what the Black radical vision is, which is briefly unified Africa, Pan-Africanism in a revolutionary sense, that says actually Africa is the only part of the world that really can take itself out of the world system because it has everything it needs in Africa, and then you just create a different society. But yeah, it's not about violence and bloodshed. It's just about building an alternative.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good way, because that is what a lot of people associate with the word radicalism too, right? It's sort of associated almost with negativity now, and it's been co-opted. And so I think, yeah, that's really good to have that explanation. I was also wondering too, if you think that the climate crisis and the pandemic are actually helpful in bringing about the revolution, because they pointed out the flaws in the system and how deeply inherently racist systems are. So do you think it's, I mean, obviously it's been devastating and awful, but it's also kind of, would you say it's woken us up a little bit?
I don't know, because the climate crisis in itself is really, like, it seems that even God is a white supremacy. I mean, like, because if you actually look at where the impacts of climate are, it's in the underdeveloped world, even though the underdeveloped world didn't really do anything, it didn't really cause any of the damage. So it's just terrible. It's ironic, or maybe not ironic, but that actually you can see those things play out. And unfortunately, it's actually making it worse, probably, because, you're seeing this impact of climate refugees, which is going to be, it's supposed to be 1 billion climate refugees in the next 100 years, who are then having to flee and being forced to flee. And then where are they fleeing? They're fleeing into the West, and there's deeply problems with immigration policy, et cetera, et cetera. There's actually anything is exacerbating the issue. And unfortunately, the kind of green left haven't really got to terms with this in any real meaningful sense. And a lot of even some of the leftist green ideas about, how do we consume? Let's have soya. Well, soya is terrible for neocolonialism. It's awful if you actually look at the impact that's having, soya production, etc. So I actually think it's made it worse. And I think COVID as well should have shown us what the fault lines are. Yeah. But really, again, if you actually look what's happening in India with the lack of vaccinations, it's just actually, again, I think it's made it worse. And COVID specifically has made it worse because the impact those lockdowns are going to have globally, devastating. I mean, there's no welfare state, there's no furlough if you're on a production line in China, right? Like, you just more poverty. And already 9 million people died from hunger a year anyway. So the poverty caused by the lockdowns is going to be more devastating, in fact, not less.
Yeah, so we're fucked. That's pretty. That's pretty bad.
Yeah.
It makes me think of. Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Anna.
Oh, sorry. I was just jumping in. I really find it phenomenal and refreshing to hear you speak about systemic racism from a global perspective, because so often I hear people, and often well-meaning white people, talking about systemic racism from a sort of a compartmentalized, American perspective or Australian perspective or British perspective or whatever it is. But it is this completely all-encompassing, and it goes beyond just racism. It's exploitation of not just people, especially people of color, but of the land, of resources, and so the way you're talking, it's just, I find it incredibly refreshing because it doesn't simplify it. Because in a way, I feel when you just hone in on one specific area or nation, you can skate over things too easily, and you don't confront the real issues that underlie the joining, the connector between all of these issues, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean that's what I try to do in the book, is just show you can because there's lots of books that do this, but there's no way to understand racism on a national scale. It's just not possible. It's a global system. In fact, that's what defines the West. It is this global system going around the world and plundering everything. And so there really is no British racism or American racism or Canadian racism. There's a system of racism that plays out differently across different parts. And when you have the global analysis, then it means you have to be radical, basically, because globally there's no doubt things are terrible and they're not really getting any better. Whereas if you look at, like, say Britain, and you've got black professors, I'm a black professor, this is great. Or America, you've got black president. Well, I mean, even on a national level, that's a pretty bad example. But on a global level, we can understand that really is meaningless.
Exactly. It's like, the changes that they've made, for example, this is just one tiny example, like in the Oscars. Like, that's great. That's great that you have to have all of these rules now in order to get for an Oscar to be nominated. It's crazy to think that we need those rules in the first place, but that's fine. That's another separate issue entirely. But have we not thought of the fact that distribution, America still controls and what we are able to see, and that there is actually still a category that's like world films or world music, like that is like anything outside of America, the UK, maybe Western Europe at a push, like that's, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's very true. Like, so I mean, I don't want to say like don't challenge the small things because they're important, but put them in the context, right? Like, we have to see what and racism is a matter of life and death, right? It isn't. Well, it is the smaller things, but those smaller things should always be connected to the bigger thing. But we often miss the point when we look at the nation, especially when we're in these Westerns, because basically the biggest divide today is: do you live in the West or do you not live in the West? That's it. That's the biggest divide. And if you don't, your life chances are, I mean, it's just so different that it can't even be compared.
And how do you define the West for people like me who don't know anything?
So the West is, so the reason I use the West, and people are somewhat different, is I use the West because take Europe in 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, it goes westward, and that Europe going west kind of unlocks everything. So America is certainly like the kind of the seat of the West. Canada, the places where white people go, the places where white people go, basically. Australia, development. I mean, other part, the West has become a bit more diverse now. So Japan would be counted as the West. It's industrialized, it's developed, capitalist economy. It's in all the the OECD. South Korea, another example. China, not at all. China's a whole different story. Like, it's just not really what pretends to be. But yeah, the West is those advanced, developed economies, which are kind of based on that European expansion
model. Sort of followed that model.
They followed that path,
quote unquote, successfully.
Yes,
in a way.
Exactly.
So yeah, you talk about like the non-white West in the book too, right? And how China has sort of exactly just taken on the Western personality or something. Yeah, and
the model. That model is really important, because then even if you have countries which aren't, like if China does become part of the West, which parts of it are, and this is also interestingly, you could make the case that some people in China are kind of in the West because of their wealth, because of, look at some of the cities. We could certainly make the case that, like, if you go to Brazil, I went to Brazil recently, like the center of Sao Paulo, that seems pretty West. It's all white people. It looks a lot like Paris, right? But actually, like most people in Brazil, you would say they don't live in the West. Actually, you make the same case in America. If you go to North Philly, some of the ghettos, that's definitely not the West. I mean, that's underdeveloped world. So yeah, even then, within the different
definitely
nations,
the same in Australia as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really, I also, sorry, you were talking about, before I forget, about like the globalized racism. And I was also, there's this book I wanted to talk to you about by Todd Dufresne called The Democracy of Suffering. And he brings in something that you argue against so powerfully. And I see it too. So he argues for the globalization of empathy, and argues, like many, that like the pandemic has been the great leveler. Mary Shelley even makes that argument in The Last Man, which is about a pandemic or a plague that destroys all of humanity, and talks about this democracy of suffering. But then you note in your book how this is actually like quite delusional, right? That this isn't the great equalizer. And I'll let you go on, but I thought that was a really good point that you made.
No, that's what. I'm not sure how it's more equal. It's less. If anything, it's less equal, right? I mean, this has shown us the inequality, but it's just made it worse in terms of global equality. Certainly, in terms of seeing how states have reacted. I mean, it's really fascinating to see. More people died last year of COVID, and will die every year of COVID, of poverty. Every year, like 9 million people died from hunger, and we don't really do anything. Nobody really cares, right? But when you have that kind of level of death that comes into the West, it's shut down, locked down, everything's double closed. Like our government's really right wing reactionary, and is acting like communism, like proper, like to see, like when white life is threatened, to see what happens, and see the concept, and then. Also importantly, as I said before, the consequences of these lockdowns, I've never heard anybody talk about this. The poverty that's going to push down the chain. I mean, this is devastating. But we're getting not a consideration that we were thinking about. And then even if you look at the vaccine access, things like that, again, it shows you the problem. Pandemic. I mean, healthcare generally, the idea that anything to do with healthcare would be a great leveler shows the ignorance that we're starting point from. Because healthcare is one of the key ways in which you can see white supremacy laid bare. So, for instance, I think one of the examples I give in the book is this vaccine thing, where it was supposed to be impossible to get a vaccine within 2 years, and they were like, 8 months, 9 months, all of a sudden, magic vaccine. Whereas malaria, which kills 500,000 children a year, it just happened to 90% be African and the other 10% be Indian. Yeah. There's been like 100 and something years we've known about malaria, no vaccine. Because they don't care. I guarantee you, if there are 500,000 white children dying from malaria, there would be a vaccine very, very, very quickly. So healthcare just shows you the way that white supremacy works.
Yeah, it makes
in a very blunt way. Would you say it's because there's no money in it?
Yeah, well, it's two ways. One is there's no money in it, but there's no money in it because of underdevelopment, right? Because you've impoverished the parts of the world. And two, they just generally don't care. Like if COVID-19 hadn't come into Europe, there'd be no vaccine. We wouldn't really get it.
But if COVID-19 was like killing, for example, cancer, no cure there yet. But there's too much money being made, right? And not enough money being lost from people dying of cancer. So no one gives a shit. No one cares.
Yeah,
but I agree with you completely that we have this, I hear this, we don't care about anyone who doesn't look or sound like us. There's definitely that, but there is a fundamental link between capitalism, the making of money, and the exploitation of human beings. And
can I just add, capitalism, colonialism, same sides of one coin, two sides of one coin, when you think about it, right? So like they come hand in hand, right? So like when we talk about accessibility to like resources, whether it's a vaccine or even goddamn clean drinking water, right? COVID has, like, if we look at Canada, the populations that have been affected the most have been the indigenous populations and the marginalized people. So people of color, BIPOC people, right? And it's because biggest thing when COVID started was social distancing, staying at home, staying safe, not working. But who can do that? People who can afford it. Rich white people, people in a higher class, people living on reses don't have that as an option. They're living in crowded homes, they're forced into these areas, and then they don't even have accessibility to like clean drinking water. They don't. So it's like, that's like something that like is like on a smaller scale. I was actually going to ask you a question. I'm sorry, Anna, I completely cut you off. I wanted to say,
I apologize.
well, what do you think that like we, as like, obviously you're an academic, and like I'm a sociology student, so I study all of this. Like I can obtain the knowledge, I understand it, at least I'm learning it. How do you break down things like globalized racism, globalization, capitalism, all of these issues to the average person? Like, how do I explain that to my parents? How do I explain that to a person on the street? Because obviously these issues are just as relevant and is just as important to be discussed in an everyday conversation, because they affect us. Because, it's more than just a social media post. It's more than just a textbook. It's happening and it's real.